Abigail Harcourt did not cry when Lydia Fairmont dropped a single silver coin beside her plate. She closed her fingers around it, slow, deliberate, until its edge cut into her palm. 50 guests watched. Her husband raised his glass. Not one person in that dining room knew that every floorboard beneath their feet, every acre beyond those windows, every mill turning along that river belonged to her. If you've ever been underestimated by someone standing on ground that was yours, subscribe, stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The supper had been Jonathan Harcourt's idea from the beginning. He had sent the invitations himself, on heavy cream paper pressed with the Harcourt seal, and he had been specific about the guest list. County commissioners, tobacco merchants, a circuit judge, 2 attorneys from Richmond, Charles Renwick, the Baltimore shipping investor who had been corresponding with Jonathan for the better part of 3 months. 51 people in total, gathered on a Thursday evening in late July of 1817, seated along a table that stretched nearly the full length of the Harcourt dining room. Abigail had set that table herself, not because she was required to, not because the household staff could not manage it, but because the table had been her mother's, purchased from an estate in Fredericksburg the year before Margaret Prescott died, and Abigail had always believed that certain things deserved to be handled by someone who understood what they meant. She sat at the far end, in a plain cream gown, her dark auburn hair pinned simply at the nape of her neck. She had chosen not to wear the garnet earrings Jonathan had given her on their 2nd anniversary. She was not entirely sure why. Perhaps she had already understood, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that this particular evening was not one she wished to move through wearing his gifts. Jonathan sat at the opposite end. Lydia Fairmont sat beside him. This was not, by that point in the summer, a surprise to anyone in the county. Lydia had been a fixture at Harcourt House since April. She was 25 years old, the daughter of a tobacco merchant named Gerald Fairmont, whose debts were considerable and whose ambitions exceeded both his resources and his judgment. Lydia was beautiful in the manner of someone who had decided early in life that beauty was a profession. She wore it like a business arrangement. That evening she had chosen a silk gown the color of deep water, and she wore Jonathan's attention the same way, publicly, deliberately, with the confidence of someone who believed possession was identical to ownership. Abigail had watched her for 3 months. She had not said anything, not because she lacked words, not because the situation did not wound her. It did. There were more. She had pressed her hand flat against the writing table in her father's old study, and simply breathed until the shaking stopped. There were evenings she had sat alone in the east parlor and stared at the river visible from the window, and thought about every moment since the wedding where she might have seen this coming clearly, and had chosen instead to look away. But Abigail Harcourt had not spent 18 months gathering documents, interviewing surveyors, and consulting with Samuel Price in order to cry at a supper table in front of a circuit judge. She had spent 18 months learning patience, the way her father had taught her to read a land deed. Slowly, methodically, until every word settled into a place she understood and could not be talked out of. So she sat at the far end of her mother's table, and she ate very little, and she watched Jonathan charm the investors, and she waited. The break, when it came from Lydia. It always did, with women like Lydia. The performance had to announce itself. The audience had to be made aware that they were watching something. The conversation had paused. One of those natural valleys in a large dinner where the noise settles and the room briefly holds its breath. When Lydia rose from her chair, she reached into the small beaded reticule beside her plate. She crossed the length of the dining room with the deliberate grace of someone who had rehearsed the walk. And she stopped beside Abigail's chair and placed a single silver coin on the white linen cloth beside Abigail's untouched wine glass. "You should take it," Lydia said. Her voice was light, almost conversational, but pitched to carry. Every person at that table heard her. Every person at that table turned. "A woman leaving her husband's house," Lydia continued, "ought not begin the road with absolutely nothing." A sound moved through the room. Not quite laughter. Something closer to the collective exhale of people who have witnessed something cruel and cannot decide whether they are permitted to enjoy it. Abigail looked at the coin, Then she looked at Jonathan. She gave him precisely what she had always given him when he stood at the edge of a decision that would define what kind of man he was. A moment. A single, unambiguous moment in which he could have spoken. In which he could have said Lydia's name in a tone that meant, "Sit down." In which he could have looked at his wife with something, anything, that acknowledged she was a person who deserved better than a silver coin placed beside her plate by his mistress in front of 50 people. Jonathan raised his glass. "Let us not," he said pleasantly, "turn a concluded arrangement into a tragedy." The laughter came then, genuine this time, nervous at the edges, but real. Something shifted inside Abigail's chest. Not broke. She would not allow herself the word broke, because broken things stayed where they fell, and she had no intention of staying anywhere. But something moved. Some last remaining belief that the man she had married still possessed, beneath everything, the simple human decency to stop short of this. That belief left her. She reached out and picked up the coin. She did not throw it back. She did not stand up too quickly or let her voice climb into something that could be described later as hysterical. She closed her fingers around the coin and held it until the edge of it pressed a line into the center of her palm. Lydia was watching her with the expression of someone waiting for a reaction they had already decided how to interpret. "At least Mr. Harcourt is allowing you to leave peacefully," Lydia said. "Many women would be grateful for such mercy." Abigail looked at her then. Really looked at her. The silk gown, the careful hair, the practiced ease of a woman who had learned to use a room's attention the way a conductor used an orchestra. "Mercy," Abigail said, "is a generous word for a woman standing on another woman's floor." The silence that followed was not the same silence as before. It had edges. Lydia's expression did not shift immediately, but something behind her eyes recalculated. Abigail set her napkin beside her plate. She pushed back her chair and stood, and she did not hurry, and she did not look at Jonathan again. She crossed to where the household steward, Thomas, stood near the east corridor doors, and she spoke to him quietly. "Open the east doors, Thomas. Please." "Yes, ma'am." "And tell no one to follow me." "Yes, ma'am." She walked out of the dining room of Harcourt House with the silver coin pressed into her palm, and 50 people watching, and not one of them knowing the thing that she had known for 18 months and had told no living person except Samuel Price. The house was not Jonathan's. The land surrounding it for 11 miles in 3 directions was not Jonathan's. The 3 grain mills along the river were not Jonathan's. The canal landing that he had spent the better part of a year secretly negotiating to sell to Charles Renwick. The landing that sat on the most commercially valuable stretch of river in the county, that controlled the only reliable deep-water access between the upper farms and the shipping route south, was not Jonathan's either. Every acre, every mill, every water right, every timber stand and tenant farm and fence line and creek crossing. All of it was held by the Prescott Land Trust, established in 1791 by Abigail's maternal grandfather, Elias Prescott, with unusual provisions that allowed for female inheritance and female trustee authority under specific conditions. Abigail Harcourt, née Prescott, was the only living beneficiary. She had known since her father died. She had said nothing. Outside, beyond the east entrance, the night air came off the river with the particular heaviness of Virginia in late July. Abigail walked past the kitchen garden and past the stone wall at the property's edge and through the iron gate to where a plain carriage had been waiting since 7 o'clock. The driver, a man named Amos, who had worked for Samuel Price for 20 years, did not ask her any questions. He handed her up and clicked the horses forward, and they moved away from Harcourt House without a lamp. Abigail opened her hand. The coin had pressed a thin red line into the center of her palm. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she closed her fingers again. She had 12 days. Samuel Price's office occupied the upper floor of a narrow brick building on a Richmond side street, between a printer and a law firm that had been losing business to Samuel's practice since 1803. Samuel himself was 66 years old, precise in speech, unhurried in manner, and possessed of a dry humor that most people mistook for coldness, until they had known him long enough to recognize it as the particular warmth of a man who had seen too much pretension to indulge any. He had been Abigail's father's attorney for 31 years. He had helped Abigail's mother draft the trust provisions that now controlled 28,000 acres of Virginia land. He had been the first person Abigail called when she found the altered documents. He rose when she came through the door. He had been expecting her. The 4 leather-bound trust ledgers were already open on the central table, alongside 2 original trustee seals, a notarized county land survey, and a folded map showing the precise boundaries of the Prescott Canal landing. "The hearing is set," he said, before she could remove her gloves. "I filed the notice of challenge this afternoon. Jonathan's attorney will receive it by tomorrow morning." "Good." Abigail sat. She placed the silver coin on the edge of the table. He moved the auction date. Samuel looked at the coin, then at her. "When did you learn this?" "Yesterday. Renwick's warehouse contractor filed a material order with the county. The materials are scheduled for delivery in 11 days. The auction has to precede the order. That moves it to the 16th. "Yes." Samuel was quiet for a moment. He picked up the coin, turned it once in his fingers, and set it back down. "That gives us 11 days to establish your independent authority under the trust." "Can we do it?" "Legally, yes. The trust language is unambiguous. Your father was very deliberate about the succession provisions, and your grandfather was even more deliberate about the trustee authority language." He paused. "But there is a problem." Abigail waited. "The original authorization page, the one that establishes your right to act as independent trustee without a male co-signatory, is missing from the county records." She went very still. "Missing. I have 4 copies of the trust instrument. I have the ledgers. I have the 1814 survey and the 1809 survey. I have the original deed of trust from 1791. But the authorization page, the specific page that names you as acting beneficiary and grants you independent trustee authority, was separately recorded at the county clerk's office in 1812, the year your father amended the trust after your marriage." Samuel folded his hands on the table. "That page is not in the county records. It was not misfiled. It was not damaged. Someone removed it." Abigail looked at the ledgers. "If that page cannot be produced," Samuel continued, "Jonathan's attorney will argue that while you hold beneficial interest in the trust property, you require a male co-trustee to exercise legal authority. He will argue that Jonathan, as your husband, fulfills that role. He will argue that Jonathan's signature on the sale authorization was therefore valid. He will argue," Abigail said slowly, "that my husband had the right to sell my land because I needed him to act on my behalf." "That is precisely what he will argue." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, somewhere below on the street, a horse shifted against a hitching post. The sound of the city moved in through the open window. Richmond in summer was all heat and business and the low persistent noise of commerce, wagons and voices, and the distant ring of the ironworks. "Who had access to the county records?" she said. "Any party to the trust, or their legal representative, with a valid request." "Jonathan." "Yes." "His mother, before she died." "Yes, although she passed 3 years before the authorization was recorded, so she had no access to that specific document." Abigail looked at the map of the canal landing. She traced the boundary line with one finger. The eastern edge where the river bent, where the deep water began, where the value was. "Silas Reed," she said. Samuel did not answer immediately. He was a state steward when the amendment was filed. He transported documents between here and Harcourt House on 3 occasions that year. She looked up. "He is the only person who had access, who is not Jonathan, and is still living." "He is also," Samuel said carefully, "the only person among that group who I believe is fundamentally honest." "Honest people," Abigail said, "can be frightened into dishonesty. Jonathan knows that. He has always known exactly which pressure to apply to exactly which person." She picked up the coin again. She turned it in her fingers the way Samuel had. "We do not have 12 days," she said. "We have 12 opportunities. 12 chances to find which person he frightened into silence before he understands that we are looking." Samuel studied her. He had known Abigail Harcourt since she was 4 years old, had watched her grow from a solemn child who sat in the corner of her father's study, reading land. Surveys to a solemn young woman who sat in the corner of his office, asking questions that most trained attorneys could not have formulated. He had attended her wedding with a quiet reservation he had not expressed, and had spent the following years watching his reservation prove itself correct. He had never once, in all that time, seen her give way to something that was not going to serve her. "The authorization page," he said. "Where do you believe it is?" Abigail set the coin down. "In Harcourt House," she said. "In the estate office. In a locked drawer in the cabinet below the south window, behind the 1803 county plat book." Samuel stared at her. "You know where it is?" "I believe I know where it is. I saw Jonathan use that drawer in March. He did not know I was in the corridor." She paused. "He locked it with a key he keeps on his watch chain." "Abigail," Samuel's voice was careful, "that document is in a house you have just publicly departed. If Jonathan discovers what we've filed—" "He'll move it," she said, "or destroy it." "Yes, which means we need to get to it first." She stood. She pulled her gloves back on, one finger at a time, deliberate and unhurried. "I need you to apply for a court-appointed records inspection, not of the county office, of the estate itself, on grounds that trust instruments were stored at the property address. That will require a judge's signature. Judge Keating is in Richmond this week. I know his schedule." She picked up the silver coin and dropped it into her glove, against her wrist. "And I need you to send a message to Silas Reed. Not a legal message, a personal one. Tell him that I am aware of the pressure being applied to his household, and that I am asking him, as a man who knew my father, to trust me for 3 more days." "And if he doesn't?" Abigail smoothed the wrist of her glove over the place where the coin rested. "Then I will go without him," she said. "But I would rather not." Silas Reed was 58 years old and had worked the Prescott lands since before Abigail was born. He had served under her father, who was a fair and exacting man. He had remained when Jonathan took over the management of the estate, because leaving would have meant abandoning the tenant families whose farm records and rental agreements he had personally maintained for 2 decades. Silas knew which families well needed repair. He knew which child had been sick through the winter, and which harvest had come up short, and which widow needed the rent reduced before she would ever ask for it herself. He knew the land, the way men know things they have watched and tended and walked through in all weathers, not as a legal instrument, but as a living system of obligations and dependencies and small yearly dignities. He also knew what was in the locked drawer below the south window. He had not touched it. He had not told Jonathan he'd seen him place it there. He had said nothing to anyone. He had gone home to his cottage on the north edge of the property and sat with his sister, Margaret, and her 3 children, and he had said nothing for many days, because Jonathan had come to him in April, not to threaten. Jonathan Harcourt was too sophisticated for direct threats. He had come to review the northern farm accounts, and at the end of the meeting, as he was gathering his papers, he had said, in the tone of a man making pleasant conversation, "Your sister's tenancy is tied to your employment, Silas. I assume you understand that the board reviewing the estate employment arrangements meets in September. A great deal depends on the recommendations I provide." He had not said, "Stay silent, or your sister loses her home." He had not needed to. Silas had understood. He had said nothing. When Samuel Price's message arrived, hand-delivered by a boy Silas didn't recognize, on a Tuesday morning while Jonathan was in town, Silas read it 3 times. Then he sat on the edge of the porch and looked at the north fields, where the summer tobacco was green and tall, and the tenant families were doing the ordinary daily work of people who needed everything to remain exactly as it was. He thought about Thomas Prescott, Abigail's father. He thought about the evening in 1809 when Thomas had sat across from him at this same table and said, without preamble, that he knew about the crop report Silas had falsified 3 years prior, the one that had hidden his brother's failed harvest so the family wouldn't lose their tenancy during a drought year. Silas had waited to be dismissed. Thomas Prescott had poured 2 glasses of cider and said, "A man who bends the truth to protect a hungry family is not the same man as a man who bends it to protect himself. I know the difference. I will not hold one against you the same way I'd hold the other." He had paused. "But Silas, The records must be right from here forward, whatever happens. Because the day we start deciding which truths the land can afford, we've already lost the land. Silas had kept the records right from that day forward. He folded Samuel Price's message and put it in his coat pocket. He sat there for another hour. Then he walked inside and began writing down everything he knew about where the pre-flood survey of the canal landing had been stored. Jonathan Harcourt received Samuel Price's legal notice at 10 o'clock on Friday morning in the study of Harcourt House while reviewing correspondence from Charles Renwick. He read the first paragraph twice. Then he set it down on the desk and looked at the window. The river was visible from the study, the same river that ran through the canal landing, the same water that Renwick's shipping contracts depended on, the same current that carried the grain barges from the upper mills south to market. He picked up the notice and read it again more carefully. His attorney, Marcus Webb, arrived within the hour. Webb was 50 years old, sharp and aggressive and deeply loyal to the fees Jonathan paid him. He sat across from Jonathan and read the notice from beginning to end without expression. "She filed on the Prescott Trust instrument," he said, when he finished. "She is claiming independent trustee authority under the 1812 amendment." "She doesn't have the authorization page," Jonathan said. "She doesn't need it if the original trust language is strong enough." "Is it?" Webb set the paper down. "The 1791 instrument is one of the most carefully drafted private trusts in Virginia. Her grandfather was a very deliberate man." A pause. "But the 1812 amendment is the critical document. Without the authorization page, she cannot prove that the amendment granted her the power to act independently. I can argue that the original trust requires a male co-trustee, and that as her husband—" "Make that argument," Jonathan said. "I will." Webb folded his hands. "But Jonathan, I need to ask you something directly." Jonathan looked at him. "The authorization page. It was recorded in 1812. It is not in the county records. Did you remove it?" A long pause. "It is not in the county records," Jonathan said, "because it was incorrectly filed." Webb studied him. He was too experienced to press the point. "I see. And the original? Is it at this property?" "The estate maintains copies of all trust documents." "Jonathan." Webb's voice was flat and entirely without judgment. "If that page surfaces, if Price finds it, or if someone provides it to the court, the argument I am building collapses. I cannot construct a defense on the assumption that a document does not exist if it does exist." Jonathan walked to the window. He looked at the river. "I thought about the first year of the marriage. Before the debts began accumulating. Before the investment scheme with Renwick presented itself. Before he had understood, gradually, and then all at once, the full financial architecture that his wife had inherited and that he had assumed, because of the natural order of things, was his to command. He had loved her in the beginning. He was certain of that. There had been genuine warmth in the first years, genuine regard, genuine pleasure in her company. Abigail had been unlike any woman he had known. Quiet where he was expansive, precise where he was instinctive, always more interested in the actual work of the estate than in the social performance it funded. He had admired that, until he had stopped admiring it. Until her precision had begun to feel like a judgment, and her silence had begun to feel like absence, and her competence had become something he needed to diminish rather than something he could share. He had told himself the story of it in a way that made sense to him, that she had trapped him, that a man had the right to know, before he married, the full nature of what he was entering into, that concealing the trust provisions was itself a form of deception. He had told himself this story many times. He had almost believed it. "I will instruct Thomas to locate the relevant estate records," he told Webb. He did not look away from the window. "Make certain they are secure," Webb said, and stood to leave. A court-appointed inspection could arrive within the week. After Webb left, Jonathan stood alone at the window for a long time. He thought about the dining room, about Lydia placing the coin beside Abigail's plate. He had not asked her to do it, but he had not stopped her. He had watched Abigail look at him across the length of the table, that particular look she had, patient and absolutely clear, The look that meant she was giving him a moment to decide something, and he had raised his glass. He had done it because it was easier than the alternative. He understood now, standing at the window with Samuel Price's legal notice on his desk, that the alternative Abigail had been offering him was not reconciliation. It was not mercy. It was a last chance to stop before she stopped him. He had declined it. He pressed his hand flat against the glass and looked at the river. His river, he had always called it, in the way of men who call things theirs because no one has corrected them yet. And he felt, for the first time in many months, something that was not ambition or anger or social calculation. He felt the particular cold of a man who has just understood that the ground beneath him was never as solid as he believed. He called for Thomas. "The estate office," he said. "Lock it." Abigail learned about the locked office from Miriam Bell. Miriam was 61 years old, widowed, and the proprietress of the most successful private mill operation in the adjacent county. She had built it herself after her husband's death, against the vigorous objections of his 2 brothers, 2 county commissioners, and 1 attorney who had told her publicly that a woman alone could not manage commercial millstone contracts. The brothers were now farming. The commissioners had been replaced. The attorney had retired. The mill was still running. Miriam had known Abigail's mother. She had no particular warmth for Jonathan Harcourt, and she expressed this without emphasis by simply never discussing him. She arrived at the Price office on Saturday afternoon without an invitation, carrying a basket of early peaches and a piece of information she had received from her cook, whose sister worked as a laundress at Harcourt House. "He locked the estate office," she said, setting the peaches on the edge of Samuel's table. "Thursday night. He had Thomas bolt it, and he kept the key." Abigail looked at Samuel. "The court inspection order hasn't been issued yet," Samuel said. "He's protecting the documents before we can reach them." "The authorization page," Abigail said, "and whatever else is in there." Miriam sat down across from Abigail and looked at her with the direct attention of a woman who had survived considerable difficulty and had no patience for pretending difficulty was something other than what it was. "You know," Miriam said, "you are handling this very well. I want you to understand that I see it. You are managing the legal effort and the practical strategy and the tenant considerations, and your own grief all at the same time, and you are managing them with remarkable discipline." Abigail said nothing. "I also want to say," Miriam continued, "that I am aware you waited longer than pure strategy required. I am not saying this to criticize. I am saying it because his attorney will say it to criticize, and I want you to have thought about how you will answer." Abigail looked at the peaches. "I waited because I hoped he would stop." "Yes. I know that's the part that doesn't sound like strategy." "It doesn't sound like strategy," Miriam agreed. "It sounds like a woman who was still married to a man she had not entirely given up on." She paused. "Which is exactly what you were. And which is also, I would argue, exactly what the women in that courtroom have all been at some point in their lives." She folded her hands on the table. "Don't perform the strategy. Tell the truth about the waiting. A judge who has been alive 60 years has watched someone he loved make a choice they shouldn't have made. He will recognize the truth of it." Abigail looked at her for a long moment. "You are telling me that my delay is not a weakness to explain away." "I am telling you," Miriam said, "that the explanation and the truth are the same thing. That is rare. Use it." Late Saturday night, Abigail sat alone in the room Samuel had arranged for her at a quiet Richmond boarding house. She opened her hand and looked at the silver coin. The mark it had pressed into her palm was gone. The skin had smoothed back. There was nothing left to prove the pressure had been there. She thought about the dining room, the laughter, Jonathan's raised glass. The particular quality of the silence after she said mercy is a generous word for a woman standing on another woman's floor. The way the room had recalculated in that instant. The way Lydia's expression had shifted from performance to something sharper and less certain. She thought about Silas Reed, somewhere on the North Farm, carrying whatever he was carrying. She thought about the locked estate office and the authorization page and the 11 days remaining before the auction. She placed the coin on the windowsill and looked at it. It was a single silver coin. Lydia had produced it from a beaded reticule with the casual contempt of a woman who believed she was discarding something of no further value. What Lydia had not understood, what Jonathan had not understood, what none of the 50 people laughing at that table had understood, was that contempt, when it was careless enough, told the person it was aimed at exactly what the person doing, the contemning, believed they had to fear. Jonathan had allowed that humiliation because he needed the county to believe the marriage was already over before the auction date. He needed witnesses who would testify later that Abigail Harcourt had departed voluntarily before the sale without objection. He had used Lydia's cruelty as a legal strategy. And he had been so certain of Abigail's powerlessness that he had done it in front of a circuit judge. Abigail picked up the coin and held it in her closed fist. She had 12 opportunities. She intended to use all of them. Outside, the summer heat pressed against the boarding house walls, and the Richmond night moved on around her. And Abigail Harcourt sat in the lamplight with her father's trust and her mother's table and her grandfather's land and 11 days, and she began to plan. The court inspection order arrived on Monday morning. Samuel had moved faster than Jonathan expected. He had found Judge Warren Keating at a private breakfast meeting on Sunday, presented the trust instrument, presented the survey, and presented a precisely worded argument that estate documents relevant to an active legal challenge could not be secured by the party under challenge without constituting obstruction of a valid court proceeding. Keating had not been pleased to have his Sunday breakfast interrupted. He was a conservative man who preferred that women manage their property disputes through male relatives, and he had made this preference visible in his expression when Samuel explained who the beneficiary was. But Keating was also, above everything else, protective of public land records. He had presided over 3 fraudulent deed cases in the past decade, and each one had begun with someone locking a door before a court-appointed inspector could walk through it. He signed the order before his coffee went cold. Jonathan's attorney received the order at 9 o'clock Monday morning. By 9:30, Marcus Webb was at Harcourt House. By 10 o'clock, Jonathan had read the order twice and called for Thomas. Thomas, who had worked in that house for 11 years, and who had opened the east doors the night Abigail left without being asked twice, stood in the study doorway with the expression of a man performing the careful neutrality of long service. "The estate office key," Jonathan said. "Where is it?" "On your watch chain, sir." A pause. "The second key, the copy." "Mrs. Harcourt asked me to hold it, sir, when the office was first organized. She said it was proper for the household to have a copy in case of emergency." Jonathan looked at him. "And where is it now?" Thomas met his eyes. "I would have to look for it, sir." Jonathan understood, from the quality of that answer, that Thomas had already looked for it and found it missing. He did not pursue it further. He unclipped the key from his watch chain and handed it to Webb. "Open the office. Everything inside is to be catalogued before the inspector arrives." Webb took the key and said nothing. What Jonathan did not know, because he had not been told, and because Thomas had not volunteered the information, was that Abigail had entered the estate office through the garden corridor at 4 o'clock that same morning. She had used the second key. 3 years of redirected tenant rental payments, recorded in a leather account book that Jonathan had kept separate from the primary estate ledgers. She had found it in the same drawer, behind the authorization page, as though Jonathan had believed that proximity was a form of concealment. She had left the office before 4:30, walked back through the garden in the summer dark, and returned to Samuel's office by 5. When Samuel arrived at 6, Abigail was sitting at his desk with the account book open and 3 pages of her own notes written in her precise, unhurried hand. He looked at the book. He looked at her notes. He sat down across from her. "Tell me you had legal access to that office," he said. "The estate office was established in 1813 from Prescott trust funds," Abigail said. "The contents of the office are, under the trust instrument, the property of the trust. I am the acting beneficiary of the trust." She looked up. "I had access." Samuel picked up her notes. He read them slowly. "He redirected 7 farm rental accounts," she said. 3 years of payments, into a private development account registered under his name alone. The money was supposed to go to the trust operating reserve. It went to his canal project instead. "How much?" Enough that when the court freezes his development accounts, which they will, once I present this, the tenant families who depend on spring seed loans from that reserve will have nothing to draw from. Samuel set the notes down. He didn't just defraud the trust. He mortgaged the tenant's security to finance his own scheme. Yes. If you present this immediately, the freeze will harm the very families I'm trying to protect. I know. Abigail closed the account book. Which is why I need 3 things before I present it. A separate trust account with sufficient capital to replace the seed loans. An agreement from Renwick to delay any action against the tenant land while the challenge is resolved. And Silas Reed willing to stand up in front of a judge and confirm the redirections were unauthorized. Samuel studied her. You need all 3 in 11 days. 10, Abigail said. I lost one while we were talking. She almost smiled when she said it. Almost. Samuel reached across the desk and put his hand briefly over hers. It was the first purely personal gesture he had made in all the months since this had begun. Your father, he said, would have been very proud of you. Abigail looked at the window. My father, she said quietly, would have told me to stop admiring the problem and get on with solving it. She pulled her hand back and picked up her pen. Send word to Miriam Bell. I need access to her mill account records for the past 3 years. She's been running comparable reserve loans for her tenant operations, and I need the documentation structure. And send another message to Silas. Not a request this time. Tell him I found the account book. Tell him I know what Jonathan threatened him with. And tell him I know about the crop report. Samuel went very still. Abigail, tell him I am not my father, she said. Tell him that my father forgave the act because he understood the reason for it. I cannot forgive something I was not present for. But I can tell him that the truth he is being asked to testify to has nothing to do with an old crop record, and that I will sign an independent guarantee of his sister's tenancy before he takes the stand. If Jonathan discovers you know about the crop report, then Jonathan discovers that the tool he has been using to keep Silas quiet is no longer sharp. She looked up. Which is exactly why I want him to discover it. Samuel stood slowly, like a man whose joints had decided to remind him of his age. I'll send the messages, he said. And Abigail? He stopped at the door. The court inspector arrives at 2 o'clock. Whatever Webb removes from that office before 2 o'clock is gone. I know, she said. She knew, because she had already confirmed the authorization page was there and had left it precisely where it was, and she was gambling on one specific thing. That Jonathan, who was methodical and proud, and deeply averse to admitting error, would not destroy the page he had removed from the county records, because destroying it would require him to acknowledge, at least to himself, that he had taken it in the first place. Jonathan Harcourt, she had learned over 6 years of marriage, could do almost anything except admit that he had been wrong. He would lock things away. He would move them. He would reframe them. But he would not destroy them, because destroying them meant they had existed, and if they had existed, then what he had done to conceal them was deliberate. Jonathan could not afford to be deliberate. He needed everything to have been an accident. She was counting on that. She was also counting on the fact that Webb, competent as he was, had received the inspection order at 9:30 and had no more than 4 hours to catalog and relocate documents from a locked office without triggering additional charges of obstruction. 4 hours was not enough time to be thorough. 4 hours was barely enough time to be careless in an organized way. At 2 o'clock, the court-appointed inspector, a meticulous county clerk named Hartwell, arrived at Harcourt House with Samuel Price and a written list of document categories relevant to the Prescott Trust. They found the authorization page in the locked drawer below the south window, behind the 1803 county plat book, exactly where Abigail had left it. Webb, to his considerable professional credit, did not react visibly when Hartwell lifted it from the drawer. He simply wrote something on his own notes and said, in a tone entirely absent of any particular feeling, "That will need to be examined by both parties." "Yes," Samuel said pleasantly. "It will." Jonathan, who was standing in the doorway of the estate office, looked at the page in Hartwell's hands. He said nothing. But Samuel Price, who had spent 31 years watching men understand that they had been outmaneuvered, watched Jonathan Harcourt understand it in the particular way of men who are accustomed to winning, slowly, and with something almost like physical pain. Outside, the July heat pressed down on Virginia. Somewhere on the North Farms, tobacco grew in long green rows, and tenant families went about the work of a summer day, entirely unaware that the ground beneath their livelihoods had just shifted in a room they would never enter. And in a Richmond boarding house, Abigail Harcourt sat with a silver coin on the windowsill and waited for Samuel's messenger, and did not allow herself to feel, yet, the full weight of what had just been accomplished. One problem at a time. That was what her father had always said. One document, one witness, one day. She still had 9 of them. Silas Reed came to Samuel's office on Tuesday evening. He did not send word ahead. He arrived on foot, in his working clothes, with the particular look of a man who has spent several days arguing with himself and has finally reached a conclusion he is not entirely comfortable with, but intends to honor anyway. Abigail was there when he arrived. She stood when he came through the door, and she did not say anything, and she did not move toward him, because she had spent enough time with Silas to know that he needed to reach the center of a room on his own terms. He removed his hat. He turned it in his hands once. "You know about the crop report," he said. "Yes." "Your father never told you." "He told me he had once dealt with a matter between 2 decent people that required him to understand that human beings sometimes make imperfect choices for defensible reasons. He did not tell me who. I worked it out from the ledgers afterward." Silas looked at his hat. "I'm not proud of it." "I know you aren't. Jonathan found out 2 years ago. I don't know how. He came to me like it was nothing, like he was discussing the weather. And he told me that a man with a falsified crop report in his past ought to be very careful about the statements he made in legal proceedings, because reputations, once questioned, were difficult to restore." He paused. He never threatened Margaret directly. He didn't have to. "I know. I want you to understand that He stopped, started again. "I kept those records right, every year after. I kept them exactly right." "I know that too." Silas looked up. He had the weathered, honest face of a man who had spent 30 years outside, and in it Abigail could see both the guilt he had been carrying and the relief of a man who is finally permitted to set something heavy down. "He moved the canal boundary marker," Silas said. "After the 1814 flood, the river shifted the bank by about 40 feet on the eastern edge. He hired a surveyor from outside the county, man named Poole, to redraw the landing boundary to include the new shoreline. He filed the new survey as a correction. But it wasn't a correction. It was an expansion. The new boundary puts an additional 6 acres of deepwater access inside what he's been calling Harcourt property." Samuel, who had been writing steadily, stopped writing. "6 acres of deepwater access," he said. "At the landing." "Yes, sir. The 6 acres that Renwick's warehouse requires for commercial barge access." Silas turned his hat once more. "Without those 6 acres, Renwick's ships can't make the turn at full load. The whole commercial arrangement depends on them. If the boundary goes back to the pre-flood survey, the landing isn't commercially viable for Renwick's purposes." The room was quiet. Abigail looked at Samuel. "The pre-flood survey," she said. "Where is it?" "Your father had the original filed in 1809. I transported it myself from this office to Harcourt House." Silas met her eyes. "It's in the east wall of the old survey cabin at the river bend. Your father sealed it himself, in '09, in a tin case behind the plaster. He told me then that land records needed to survive the land itself sometimes. That floods came and lawyers came, and the original truth needed to be somewhere that neither of them could reach." Abigail felt something in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite gratitude, but lived between the two. The particular feeling of a daughter who discovers, years after her father is gone, that he had been protecting her in ways she had never been told about. "He knew," she said. "Not a question. He suspected," Silas said. "He told me in 1815, 6 months before he died, that he had come to have concerns about how the estate was being managed. He didn't name Jonathan directly, But he told me that if anyone ever came looking for the pre-flood survey with the wrong purpose, I should remember where the right one was. And when Jonathan came looking, Silas's jaw tightened. He never asked me directly. He asked about the 1814 correction filing. He didn't know your father had kept the 1809 original separately. He thought the only survey in existence was the one Poole filed. Samuel set down his pen. If we produce the 1809 survey at the hearing, the boundary reversion alone destroys the commercial viability of Renwick's contract. Jonathan's entire deal collapses on geography, independent of the trust fraud. Yes, Silas said. That's correct, sir. Abigail looked at Silas for a long moment. Will you testify? He didn't hesitate. Not this time. Yes, ma'am, I will. I will guarantee your sister's tenancy in writing before you take the stand, not conditional on the outcome, regardless. I know you will. He put his hat back on. That's not why I'm saying yes. He looked at her steadily. I'm saying yes because your father kept the records right for 30 years and died trusting that the land would be handled the way he'd always handled it. And Jonathan Harcourt took that trust and he used it for himself. And I have spent 2 years being too afraid to say so. He moved toward the door. I reckon I've been afraid long enough. After he left, Samuel sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. 9 days, he said. 8, Abigail said. We need to get to that survey cabin before Jonathan discovers we know about it. She went that night, not alone. She took Amos, who drove, and Thomas, who had appeared at Samuel's office that afternoon carrying a canvas bag containing 3 items. The second key to the estate office, which he had confirmed he had not given to Webb, a copy of the household account ledger for the past year, which documented Lydia Fairmont's expenses as a guest of Harcourt House charged against the estate's operating funds, and a quiet, careful statement that he had worked for the Prescott family before he had worked for Jonathan Harcourt, and that he had a long memory. Abigail had looked at the account ledger. Lydia's gowns, Lydia's household goods, Lydia's personal correspondence posted under the Harcourt franking privilege. 3 months of Lydia Fairmont's comfortable existence at Harcourt House, paid from a trust that Lydia did not know existed, and that Jonathan had explicitly told Lydia was his own family fortune. She had looked at Thomas. Does she know about the trust? No, ma'am. Mr. Harcourt has told her the estate is Harcourt family property going back 3 generations. Abigail set the ledger down. Thank you, Thomas. Yes, ma'am. He had turned to go. Thomas? He stopped. What made you decide to come today? He had considered this question seriously before answering. I watched you walk out of that dining room, ma'am, he said. You walked out like a woman who knew exactly where she was going. I have been in service long enough to know what that looks like. He paused. And I have been in service long enough to know what it costs. The survey cabin was a mile from the river bend, in a stretch of land that the flood had altered enough to make the path uncertain in the dark. Amos held the lamp while Abigail and Thomas worked the old plaster panel behind the east wall shelf. Carefully, because the seal had been placed 20 years before, and she did not want to damage what was inside. The tin case was there. Her father had wrapped it in oilcloth inside the tin, and the oilcloth had done its work. The 1809 survey was intact. Her father's seal was intact. The boundary lines were drawn in his surveyor's ink, and the eastern edge of the canal landing was marked precisely as it had been before the flood shifted the bank, 40 feet east of the line Jonathan's hired man had filed as a correction. Abigail sat on the cabin floor with the survey in her lap and a lamp beside her, and did not speak for several minutes. Thomas and Amos waited. Finally she looked up. He planned for this, she said. He planned for the possibility that someone would try to alter the boundary. He put the original where it couldn't be tampered with. She looked down at the survey again. I was protecting the tenants, the 6 acres of deepwater access. The tenant families use that stretch of river for their own barge transport. If Renwick's commercial operation takes it over, they lose their shipping access. Yes, ma'am, Amos said. Been using that stretch since before I was born. She held the survey carefully, like something that had kept a long, faithful watch, and she did not cry, because she had made herself a rule about that. But she pressed her fingers to the corner where her father's seal was, and she held them there for one moment. "All right," she said. She stood. "Let's go." Jonathan discovered on Wednesday that Silas Reed had visited Samuel Price's office. He did not discover this through any sophisticated information network. He discovered it because the county was small and people talked, and a man who ran a tobacco delivery to Richmond on Tuesday evening had mentioned seeing Silas entering a building on the side street where Price's office was located, and that man was one of the wagoners Jonathan used for his grain transport, and he had mentioned it casually at the mill yard Wednesday morning because it seemed like the kind of thing Mr. Harcourt might want to know. Jonathan had him repeat it twice. Then he went home and sent for Webb. "Reed knows where the pre-flood survey is," he told Webb, before the attorney had removed his coat. "He transported it in 1809. I never thought he retained the location because your father stored it at the property, and it should have been—" He stopped. "It wasn't at the property. Price would have found it already if it was at the property." Webb sat down. He had the contained look of a man revising a plan under pressure. "If Reed testifies to the survey location, and Abigail produces the 1809 original, the boundary reversion eliminates Renwick's commercial access. The entire canal transaction collapses. I know what it means." "Jonathan," Webb's voice was carefully level, "I need to understand the full scope of what I am managing before the hearing. The altered boundary, the redirected rental accounts, the authorization page, which Hartwell now has in custody, the altered signature on the trustee document." A pause. "Is there anything else?" Jonathan looked at his desk. He thought about the letter he had written to Renwick in March, the one where he had described the canal landing as clear Harcourt property, free of competing claims, with no outstanding trust restrictions. He thought about the second letter, the one where he had outlined the investment terms and described the development timeline and guaranteed Renwick's right to exclusive commercial access. He thought about the third letter, the one he had written to his own cousin in Baltimore, explaining why the marriage to Abigail had run its course and outlining the advantage of an alliance with Renwick's family instead. "There are letters," he said. Webb waited. "Renwick has copies. My cousin has copies." He picked up the account ledger and set it down again. "Lydia may have seen one of them." Webb was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost its careful levelness. "You showed Lydia Fairmont a letter describing your plans to marry Renwick's daughter?" "I did not show it to her. She may have found it." "Found it? She occasionally—" Jonathan stopped. "She had access to the study." Webb stood. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to the room, which was the closest he would come, in a professional context, to expressing something that was not strictly legal analysis. "Jonathan," he said, without turning around, "in my experience, a woman who has discovered she has been used as a means to an end, and who is already the subject of public attention for a specific act of cruelty toward the person she was used against, is the most dangerous witness in any legal proceeding, because she has nothing left to protect." Jonathan said nothing. "If Lydia Fairmont has seen that letter," Webb continued, "she already knows that the public humiliation at that dinner served a legal strategy rather than personal feeling. She knows she was a prop. And she has had—" He turned from the window. "How many days?" "Since Friday." 5 days, Webb said, "to decide what to do with that knowledge." He picked up his coat. "I need to know immediately if she contacts you. And Jonathan—" He stopped at the door. "Do not contact her first. Whatever you say to her now becomes testimony." Jonathan sat alone after Webb left. The silence in the study had a quality it hadn't had before. Not the comfortable silence of a prosperous house, but the silence of a room where someone had just named the dimensions of a disaster accurately and in full. He thought about Lydia. He thought about the letter. He thought about whether she had read it carefully enough to understand the timeline it described. The sale, the transaction, the introduction to Renwick's daughter, the marriage proposal that he had already been building the architecture for since January. He thought about Abigail in the dining room, closing her fingers around the coin. He had been so certain, in that moment, that she was closing her fingers around her own powerlessness. I understood now, sitting alone in a study built on land that was not his, surrounded by books selected by a woman he had spent 4 years dismissing, in a room whose repairs had been funded by mills he did not own, that she had been closing her fingers around evidence. He had handed it to her. He had handed her the motive, the witnesses, and the date, all in one dinner. He pressed both hands flat on the desk and looked at them. Outside, summer moved across Virginia the way it always had. Indifferent. Continuous. Entirely unconcerned with the private calculations of men who had mistaken someone else's patience for surrender. Lydia found the letter on a Thursday. Not because she had been looking for it specifically. She had been looking for a promissory note Jonathan had mentioned in April, something related to her father's account, because her father had written to her twice in the past 2 weeks, asking whether she had confirmed the terms Jonathan had described. She had been systematically working through the correspondence in the study's left side drawer when she found the letter to the Baltimore cousin. She read it once, standing up, the way people read things they expect to be routine. She read it twice, sitting down. The third time, she read it very slowly, with the particular attention of a woman who is confirming that the words mean exactly what she thinks they mean, and that there is no alternate interpretation available to her. The letter described the marriage plan in detail. Renwick's daughter, the social alignment, the commercial benefit, the convenience of the timing. The sale would complete before the new engagement became public, which would prevent any question of impropriety. The letter also described, in terms that were professionally courteous and entirely without warmth, the function that Lydia had served. Jonathan had written to his cousin. The public nature of the arrangement with Miss Fairmont has been useful in establishing the conclusion of the Harcourt marriage, which is necessary for clean title in the property transaction. Once the sale concludes, that arrangement will also conclude, and I trust you to be discreet about the transition. Useful. Lydia sat with the letter in her hands. She had been useful. She had crossed a dining room in a silk gown and placed a coin beside another woman's plate and delivered lines that 50 people had witnessed. And she had done it because she had believed that her position was already secure, and that this was a performance of existing authority rather than a service being rendered. She had not been claiming anything. She had been being used to claim it on Jonathan's behalf. And Abigail Harcourt, who had sat at the end of that table in a plain cream gown and closed her fingers around the coin without throwing it back, had known. Had looked at Lydia with those quiet gray-blue eyes and said, "Mercy is a generous word for a woman standing on another woman's floor," and had left the room, and Lydia had told herself that was the exit of a defeated woman. She set the letter on the desk. Then she picked it up again and folded it carefully, the way you fold something you intend to keep. She sat in the study for a long time. She thought about her father's debts. She thought about the promissory note that Jonathan had described to her father in terms that were, she now understood, almost certainly as accurate as everything else Jonathan had described to everyone else. She thought about a woman in a plain carriage, leaving through the east gate in the dark. She thought about the specific quality of Abigail Harcourt's voice when she had answered, "Mercy." Lydia had spent most of her adult life in rooms where other people made decisions about what she was worth. She had learned to perform within those decisions, to make the performance compelling enough that it looked like agency. She had been very good at it. She was sitting in one of those rooms right now, holding a letter that described her value to the person who claimed to admire her most. And the number was exactly what Abigail's number had been at that dinner table. 1 coin. Lydia stood. She folded the letter and put it inside her glove, against her wrist. The way a woman carries something she needs to remember is real. Then she went upstairs and wrote a note. Brief, specific, asking for a meeting at a location Jonathan would not expect, and gave it to the housemaid to deliver to a Richmond address she had memorized 3 weeks ago, because she had been curious about Abigail Harcourt's attorney, and curiosity was a habit she had never quite managed to discipline out of herself. She sealed it. She pressed the wax firmly, and downstairs, in the study where Jonathan kept his plans, the summer light moved across the desk in the long, indifferent way of Virginia afternoons, and Lydia Fairmont made the first decision in months that was entirely her own. Lydia's note arrived at Samuel's office on Thursday evening, delivered by a housemaid who handed it to Amos at the door and left without giving her name. Samuel read it first. Then he passed it to Abigail without comment. It said, "I have something you need. Meet me tomorrow morning. The Miller's Creek Crossing, 7 o'clock. Come without your attorney." Abigail read it twice. She set it on the desk. She picked up the silver coin from where it had been sitting beside her ink bottle all week, turned it once, and set it back down. "Don't go," Samuel said. "I'm going." "Abigail, she placed that coin on your plate in front of 50 witnesses. Whatever she's offering now, she's offering it because she needs something from you. That is not the same as being trustworthy." "I know the difference," Abigail said. "I've known Lydia Fairmont for 3 years. She is not a good woman, and she is not a bad woman. She is a woman who has spent her entire life making calculations about what she can afford and what she cannot." She folded the note. "She's decided she can no longer afford Jonathan." That could mean anything. It means she found the letter. Abigail stood. "He wrote to his cousin about the Renwick girl in March." "I know he did, because the cousin's wife mentioned the engagement plans at a dinner in April, and she looked at me when she said it, and I understood then that she was not being careless." She picked up the coin. "Lydia has had access to that study for 3 months. She found it, and she has spent however many days since then deciding whether to use it." She looked at Samuel directly. "She's made her decision, and whatever she's bringing to that crossing tomorrow morning is genuine, because Lydia Fairmont does not take risks for theater. She takes them for survival." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "What does she want in return?" "Her father," Abigail said. "Jonathan borrowed against Gerald Fairmont's tobacco contracts using terms he misrepresented. If the development accounts freeze and the sale collapses, Fairmont is exposed. He'll lose the business." She paused. "She wants me to separate her father's exposure from Jonathan's fraud, which I can do, if Price's team can prove the misrepresentation was Jonathan's alone." "Can we?" "The account book you're holding contains 3 years of unauthorized redirections." She moved toward the door. "Find me the entry where Jonathan recorded the Fairmont contract as collateral. It will be there. He kept everything. That was always his particular vanity. He believed his own records were too well hidden to matter." She left before Samuel could object further. The Miller's Creek Crossing was a narrow wooden bridge on the county road that separated the Prescott Northern Farms from the public grazing land. At 7 in the morning, it was empty except for birdsong and the sound of water below, and Lydia Fairmont standing on the far side in a dark traveling cloak, without her silk and without her performance. She looked different without the performance. Younger, harder, more real. She waited until Abigail crossed the bridge before she spoke. "I have 3 letters," she said. "One to his cousin, one to Renwick, describing the property as free of trust claims. One to a county commissioner whose name I will give you when I know my father is protected." She held the packet but did not extend it. "The commissioner letter establishes that Jonathan paid for a favorable boundary review opinion. It is not a formal bribe document, but in the hands of your attorney, with the altered survey, it will be." Abigail looked at this packet. She did not reach for it. "What did the letter to the cousin say about you?" she asked. Lydia's jaw tightened. "That the arrangement had been useful." A pause. "And that it would conclude after the sale." "How long have you known?" 5 days. "And before you found the letter?" Lydia looked at the water below the bridge. "I knew something was wrong in April, when Renwick came to the house for the first time. Jonathan introduced me as a family friend." She said the last 2 words the way people say things that have already finished hurting because they've been held long enough to go numb. I told myself I had misread it. I was very good at telling myself that. "Yes," Abigail said. "So was I." The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the silence of 2 women standing on a narrow bridge with the same man's choices between them, which is a particular kind of silence that has no easy name. Lydia held out the packet. Abigail took it. "My father didn't know," Lydia said. "He believed Jonathan's terms were legitimate. He signed in good faith. I know he did. I found the collateral entry in the redirected account records. Jonathan recorded your father's contract against a trust asset he had no authority to pledge." She tucked the letters inside her coat. "When the fraud is established, your father's exposure collapses with it. He signed against a false instrument. The obligation isn't valid. Something moved through Lydia's face, relief, and behind it, something that was not yet shame, but was getting there. "I want to be useful," Lydia said. Not the way he meant that word. Actually useful. Abigail looked at her steadily. "Will you testify about the dinner?" "Yes." "About your own role in it, not just Jonathan's?" Lydia met her eyes. "Yes." "I will not protect you from the social consequences of that," Abigail said. "I can protect your father from the financial consequences of Jonathan's fraud. I cannot protect you from what you chose to do." "I know." "Then we understand each other." She turned and walked back across the bridge. She did not thank Lydia. Not because she was cruel, but because gratitude was not what this moment required. Lydia was not doing Abigail a favor. She was doing the only honest thing available to her after several months of dishonest ones, and gratitude for that would have diminished them both. Behind her, Lydia stood on the far side of the crossing for a long time before she walked back to her own carriage. The hearing was set for Monday. Samuel filed the additional evidence on Friday. The redirected account records, the commissioner letter, the pre-flood survey, and the authorization page now in court custody. Webb received the filing at noon and called Jonathan at 1 o'clock. Jonathan arrived at Webb's Richmond office at 2. He read the evidence list twice. "The commissioner letter," he said. "How did she get the commissioner letter?" "I don't know yet." "Lydia." He said it with the flat certainty of a man who has just confirmed a calculation he didn't want to make. "She found the cousin letter. I was careless." He set the list down. "Can we suppress the account records? Unauthorized removal from the estate office." "The office contents are trust property," Webb said. "I told you this when the inspection was filed. She had access. The records are valid." Jonathan stood. He walked to the window. He came back. He sat down. He was not a man accustomed to the specific physical restlessness of finding no position comfortable, and it showed. "The pre-flood survey," he said. "Poole filed the correction in 1814. The original is 20 years old. The original is sealed, notarized, and in her father's handwriting. The correction was filed by a surveyor hired by you 3 months after the flood, for a fee you paid privately." Webb's voice had no softness in it. "A judge who has spent 30 years reading land fraud cases will not find the sequence ambiguous." "Then what am I left with?" Webb was quiet for a moment. "You are left with the argument that she concealed the trust provisions before marriage, that she allowed you to manage trust property for 6 years without disclosing her authority, that her silence constituted a form of consent." He paused. "It is not a strong argument, but it is the argument I have. Use it." "Jonathan." Webb folded his hands on the desk. "I need you to understand what using that argument means. I will have to characterize your wife as a deceiver. I will have to portray her patience as manipulation. I will have to suggest that her silence was a trap." He looked at his client directly. "And I need you to understand that every person in that courtroom who has been married, who has a daughter, who has a mother, every one of them will watch a woman explain why she waited and hoped, and they will know the truth of it, because they have all waited and hoped themselves." Jonathan looked at his desk. "Use it," he said again. The hearing convened Monday morning in Judge Keating's circuit courtroom, a high-ceilinged room that smelled of old wood and ink, and the particular gravity of decisions that could not be unmade. Keating was 63, white-haired, and possessed of the deliberate neutrality of a judge who had learned long ago that appearing to have no opinion was the most efficient way of controlling a room. He had reviewed the filed evidence over this weekend. His expression, when he looked at Abigail as she took her seat beside Samuel, gave nothing away. Webb opened first. How was efficient and precise, and completely without theatrical excess, which was what made him effective. He presented the argument in clean sequence. Abigail had entered the marriage without disclosing the trust's scope. She had permitted Jonathan to exercise management authority over the estate for 6 years. She had allowed him to present the property as the foundation of Harcourt commercial enterprise to business associates, county officials, and investors. Her concealment, Webb argued, had created a reasonable reliance interest. Jonathan had built his professional identity on an assumption that his wife had never corrected. A wife's silence, Webb told the court, is not a neutral act. When a man acts in good faith upon an understanding his wife has never contradicted, that understanding carries weight. Keating made no visible response. Samuel responded methodically. The trust instrument, the authorization page, the pre-flood survey, the altered signature, the redirected accounts. He laid each piece on the record without drama, in the manner of a man who believes that evidence, assembled honestly, speaks more effectively than any performance. Then Keating looked at Abigail. "Mrs. Harcourt," he said, "I want to ask you directly, and I want a direct answer. You have stated that you began gathering evidence of your husband's unauthorized transactions 18 months ago. The trust instrument dates to your grandfather's lifetime. Your authority as beneficiary was established at your father's death in 1815. He paused. "Why did you wait?" The courtroom was very quiet. Webb had prepared for an answer about legal strategy. He had prepared responses to legal strategy. He had not prepared for what Abigail said. She looked at Judge Keating, directly, without dropping her eyes, and she said, "At first I was gathering evidence. Before that I was gathering courage." A pause. "And before that I was still hoping the man I married would decide not to become the man standing before this court." The courtroom did not react loudly. It was not that kind of room. But something shifted in the quality of the silence, the way a room's air changes when a window is opened. Keating studied her. He was a man who had been married for 38 in Richmond and a granddaughter in Charlottesville, who had presided over more dishonest land transactions than he cared to count. He had not expected honesty. He had expected performance, the way everyone in a courtroom expected performance. He said, "Continue." Webb rose. "Your Honor, Mrs. Harcourt's emotional state at the time of her delay does not speak to the legal question of—" "Sit down, Mr. Webb." Webb sat. "Continue," Keating said again. Abigail said, "I know my waiting looked like acceptance. I know that from the outside, 6 years of not speaking is difficult to distinguish from 6 years of consent. I cannot make that look different than it was." She folded her hands on the table in front of her. "But I can tell this court that I never transferred title. I never signed an authorization. I never, in 6 years, agreed to a sale. And the law this court is charged with applying does not require a woman to repeatedly announce what she has never surrendered. It only requires that she never surrender it." She paused. "I did not." Webb was on his feet again. "Your Honor, I have a document I'd like entered into evidence." Keating looked at him. "What document?" "A letter written by Mrs. Harcourt to her husband in the first year of their marriage." Webb approached the clerk. "In it, she explicitly states, and I will quote directly, 'What is mine is part of the life we build together.'" Samuel was on his feet. "Your Honor, a private marital letter cannot constitute a legal transfer of—" "I am aware of that, Mr. Price." Keating took the letter from the clerk. He read it. He set it on the bench. "Mr. Webb, you are arguing that this sentence gave your client authority over trust property. I am arguing that it establishes an intent to share. It establishes that a woman, in the first year of her marriage, expressed love for her husband." Keating's voice was dry. "I am going to need a stronger legal theory than sentiment, Mr. Webb." "Your Honor, if I may—" "You may sit down." But Webb did not sit down, and what he did next was something Samuel had not anticipated, because it was something only a man who had run out of legitimate arguments would attempt. He turned to Abigail directly, not to Keating, not to the room, but to her, and he said, "Mrs. Harcourt, your husband would like to speak to you." Jonathan rose from his chair. The room shifted again. Jonathan Harcourt was a handsome man who carried himself well and had spent 37 years understanding how to use a room's attention. Even now, in the context of a hearing that was going badly for him, he had a quality of assurance that other men studied and could not replicate. He looked at Abigail. He said, "I loved you. I want you to know that. In the beginning, I loved you." The room was absolutely silent. Abigail looked at him. She did not look away. She did not soften. But she did not harden either. "I know," she said. Something flickered in Jonathan's face. He had not expected that answer. He had expected denial, or anger, or tears. He had expected her to challenge the statement, which would have allowed him to elaborate it, to use it. She had agreed with him and removed the weapon from his hand in one sentence. "Then you understand," he said, pressing forward, "that I believed, genuinely believed, that what I was building was for both of us. That the canal project, the development—" "Jonathan." Her voice was quiet, not unkind, entirely unmovable. "You loved being trusted. That is real. But you loved being admired more than you loved knowing me. And the day you chose the canal over the conversation we should have had, that was not a decision made for both of us." She paused. "You cannot claim you were building a life for someone you had already decided was not worth consulting." Jonathan opened his mouth, closed it. Webb, sensing the moment collapsing, moved to redirect. "Your Honor, the emotional dimension of the Harcourt's marriage does not—" "Call your next witness, Mr. Webb," Keating said. He sounded tired. Webb called Jonathan to testify formally about the survey correction. Jonathan answered precisely, and without admission of wrongdoing, the way a man answers when he has rehearsed the answers and is relying on the rehearsal because the truth has become unavailable to him. Then Samuel called Silas Reed. Silas walked to the front of the room the way he walked everywhere, steadily, without hurry, with the physical confidence of a man who has spent 30 years knowing exactly where his feet were on uncertain ground. He sat down. He removed his hat. He held it in his lap. Webb rose immediately. "Mr. Reed, you are aware, are you not, that your employment history includes a falsified crop report filed in—" "Yes," Silas said. Webb paused. He had expected a denial, or at minimum hesitation. "You admit it?" "I do. I falsified a crop yield record in 1806 to prevent a tenant family from losing their holding during a failed harvest." Thomas Prescott became aware of it that same year. He confronted me, he told me he understood my reason, and he told me the records had to be right from that point forward. Silas looked at Webb directly. "They have been right every year since. I can produce 30 years of estate survey and farm records if this court wants to examine them." Webb shifted. "Mr. Reed, were you present when the 1814 flood boundary correction was filed?" "No, I was not involved in the pool survey." "But you are aware of the pre-flood survey, the 1809 original?" "Yes. I transported it from Mr. Price's office to Harcourt House myself, in September of 1809, at Thomas Prescott's instruction." "And where is that survey now?" "In court custody," Silas said. "Mrs. Harcourt retrieved it from the location Mr. Prescott specified for safekeeping. A sealed tin case in the east wall of the survey cabin at the river bend." He paused. "Mr. Prescott told me in 1815, 6 months before he died, that the original survey needed to be somewhere neither floods nor lawyers could reach it." He looked at Webb without expression. "Seems like he was right on both counts." A sound moved through the courtroom. Not laughter. Something closer to recognition. Webb tried 2 more questions and got nowhere useful with either of them. He sat down. Samuel called Lydia Fairmont. She came in from the side corridor, where she had been waiting since 9 o'clock, and she walked to the front of the room in a plain gray dress that was the first genuinely unperformed thing Abigail had ever seen her wear. She sat down. She did not look at Jonathan. Samuel asked her to describe the events of the dinner on July 17th. She described them accurately. The coin, the words, the 50 guests, Jonathan's raised glass. "Did Mr. Harcourt instruct you to make that gesture?" Samuel asked. "He suggested that a public demonstration of the marriage's conclusion would be helpful before the auction." She paused. "He didn't say it in those exact words. He said that it would be better for everyone if there was no question about what Abigail's position in the household was before the transaction completed. I understood what he meant." "And did you understand at the time that you were serving a legal strategy rather than expressing a personal sentiment?" Lydia looked at her hands. "I understood that I was doing something that served Jonathan's interests. I told myself it also served mine." She looked up. "I was wrong about the second part." Why were you wrong? A pause. Because I found a letter describing what he intended to do after the sale completed, and my name was not in it as anything other than a problem to be managed. She said it steadily, without self-pity. I was useful to him in the same way a tool is useful. And I allowed that because I convinced myself the tool was choosing to be used. She looked at Keating. It wasn't. Webb's cross-examination was brief and, for the first time in the hearing, visibly frustrated. He challenged her motive. She agreed she had one. He challenged her credibility. She agreed it was damaged. He challenged her account of Jonathan's words. She produced a written record she had kept at the time, because Lydia Fairmont, whatever her failings, had always understood that a woman in her position needed to keep records. Webb sat down with the expression of a man who has run out of terrain. Samuel placed the commissioner letter into evidence, then the Renwick correspondence, then the redirected account book with the Fairmont collateral entry marked. Then he placed the authorization page on the evidence table. Then the pre-flood survey. Then the court's own copy of the 1791 trust instrument, open to the succession provisions. He did not say anything dramatic. He simply arranged the documents in sequence and let Keating read them. Keating read them for 11 minutes. No one in the room spoke. When he finished, he looked at Jonathan over his glasses. Jonathan was sitting very still. He was looking at the documents on the table the way a man looks at the ruins of something he built. Not with shock, because shock requires surprise, and Jonathan had run out of surprise sometime around the moment Silas walked to the front of the room without flinching. He was looking at it with the particular expression of a man who understands, finally and completely, the difference between the story he has been telling about himself and the facts of what he has done. It was not a comfortable expression to look at. It was, Abigail thought, the most honest she had ever seen him. Keating set the documents down. A wife's silence, he said, is not a husband's title deed. He said it quietly and without performance, the way men say things they intend to be remembered. Then he proceeded to the ruling. Jonathan's trustee authorizations were invalid. The altered signature would be referred for criminal review. The canal landing remained under the Prescott Trust. The planned sale was prohibited. Tenant accounts were to be protected during transition, and Abigail Harcourt was confirmed as acting beneficiary and independent trustee under the provisions of the 1791 instrument as amended in 1812. Webb began to speak. Keating looked at him. Webb sat down. Abigail sat very still while Samuel shook her hand, and Silas, across the room, put his hat back on with the air of a man who has done what he came to do and is ready to go back to the land where the tobacco needed attention. She did not look at Jonathan, not because she was refusing to, because she had already looked at him as much as the moment required, during the exchange at the evidence table, and she did not believe in looking at things past the point they were useful. She looked at the coin she had set on the evidence table when Webb accused her of inventing the dinner scene. It sat beside the 12 signed witness statements Samuel had collected from dinner guests over the past week, 12 people who had been in that room and who had, when asked formally, told the truth about what they had seen. The coin had not won the case. The documents had won the case. But the coin on that table had done something the documents could not do. It had given every person in the room a single object to look at while they understood what had happened and why. She reached out and picked it up. It was just a coin, silver, ordinary, worn at the edges from being carried, worth nothing in particular, worth everything she had built around it. She closed her fingers. Old habit now. Outside the courtroom, in the corridor, Jonathan was waiting. He had sent Webb ahead. He stood alone beside the window in the particular attitude of a man who has decided to say something and is not certain he deserves to. Abigail stopped. She did not owe him this. She knew that. But she had also always believed that certain conversations were worth having, not because they changed anything, but because they completed something. And she did not intend to spend the rest of her life with an incomplete conversation between her and the truth. "I did love you," he said. "I know," she said. The same answer as before. "Then you know that what I did, the fraud, the scheme, it wasn't because I felt nothing for you. I know it wasn't." She looked at him directly. That's the part that took me the longest to understand. That a man can love a woman and still decide that her value is best measured in what she can provide him. She paused. You loved being trusted. You loved the estate and the mills and the reputation they gave you. And somewhere in there, you loved me too. But when you had to choose between loving me and believing you had the right to decide what I should give up. She stopped. You loved being right more than you loved being honest. Jonathan looked at the window. Is there anything left between us? The truth, she said. It's the only thing between us that still deserves a place. She moved to walk past him. He said, Abigail. She stopped. She did not turn. I'm sorry, he said. I know that has no value at this point, but it's true. She stood for a moment. She thought about the dining room, the raised glass, the 50 people laughing. The particular quality of the silence after she said mercy is a generous word for a woman standing on another woman's floor. I believe you, she said. She walked to the end of the corridor. Behind her, Jonathan stood alone at the window, and the summer light fell across the floor around him, and Virginia went on being Virginia. Heat and commerce and the river moving south, entirely indifferent to the private accounting of what a man loses when he mistakes another person's patience for a gift he is permitted to spend. Samuel met her on the front steps. He looked at her face and said nothing for a moment. Then, It's not over. She looked at him. I received word from the county accounts office this morning. Jonathan's development loans, the ones secured against the coming harvest, they're called due. The lender filed this morning, 1 hour after news of the hearing spread. He paused. If the accounts freeze immediately, the bank may have standing to claim harvest equipment and stored grain as collateral. Some of it is on tenant land. Abigail looked at the street. At the Richmond traffic moving past, ordinary and continuous. The families, she said. Yes. She had won the estate. She had stopped the sale. She had proven the fraud and secured the trust and put the authorization page back where it belonged. She had done everything she had set out to do. And Jonathan's debts were about to fall like a second roof onto the shoulders of people who had never borrowed anything from anyone and had nothing to do with what he had decided to build on land that was not his. She held the silver coin in her closed hand. She had thought the hardest part was the waiting. She had thought the hardest part was the courtroom. She understood now that the hardest part was this: winning, and discovering that winning was not the end of the responsibility. That what came after the courthouse was larger than the courthouse. That the estate she had recovered was full of people whose lives were threaded through its accounts, its equipment, its seasonal rhythms, its particular dependencies, and that none of them had asked to be part of what Jonathan had done, and all of them would feel what happened next regardless. How long do we have? She asked. The bank will move on the equipment within 10 days if the accounts aren't restructured. She turned back toward Samuel's office. Then we have 10 days, she said. And I need to talk to Miriam Bell tonight and Charles Renwick tomorrow and every tenant family representative by the end of the week. Abigail. One problem at a time, she said. That's what my father always said. She walked back into the building where they had spent 10 days building a case that the law recognized, and she began building the next one, the harder one, the one with no courtroom and no ruling and no judge to say the right words at the end. The one that was just the land and the people on it, and the work of being responsible for both. Miriam Bell arrived at Samuel's office that same evening with a plate of cold cornbread, a bottle of cider, and the expression of a woman who had already heard about the hearing and had spent the carriage ride over, thinking about what came next, rather than what had just concluded. She set the food on the edge of the desk, poured 2 glasses without asking, and sat across from Abigail. The bank filed this morning, she said. It was not a question. 1 hour after the ruling spread, Abigail said. Which bank? Merchant and Agricultural, Richmond. The development loans were secured against the coming harvest. Grain stores, equipment, 2 of the canal-adjacent mill structures. Abigail spread Samuel's notes across the desk between them. Some of the collateral documentation lists equipment that sits on tenant land, not trust land, tenant-held land. Miriam picked up the notes. She read quickly, the way people read who have spent years reviewing contracts under pressure. Her expression did not change, but her jaw set. "He pledged equipment that wasn't his to pledge," she said. "He pledged everything within reach. The question now is whether the bank's claim against the equipment is valid if the underlying loan was secured against a fraudulent representation of the estate's ownership. Is it? Samuel believes we can challenge the loan's validity in its entirety on fraud grounds. But that proceeding will take weeks. The bank won't wait weeks before moving on the collateral." Miriam set the notes down. How much would it take to bridge the tenant accounts? Seed loans, equipment, operating reserve. Just enough to hold the families through the challenge. Abigail had already done the calculation. She had done it on the carriage ride from the courthouse. $11,000. 12 if we account for the Hendricks farm, which is behind on the mill lease because Jonathan redirected their payments without crediting them. Miriam drank her cider. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she looked at Abigail. "The trust can't release that capital before the accounts are restructured under the new trustee arrangement." "No, and you don't have it personally." "No." "I do," Miriam said. Abigail looked at her. "Not comfortably," Miriam added. "It will clean out my operating reserve, and I'll need it back within 18 months. But I have it." She folded her hands. "I spent 14 years building a business after my husband's brothers told me I couldn't manage a millstone contract. I have not forgotten what it costs a family to lose equipment in October." She looked at Abigail with the steady directness that was her particular form of warmth. "This is not charity. This is a commercial loan from my personal account to the Prescott Trust, at a fair rate, to be repaid when the trust accounts are released. Samuel will draft the terms tonight." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "Miriam, don't thank me yet. Thank me when the Hendricks family has their seed money, and the Coopers still have their grain press, and none of these people know how close it came." Miriam stood and refilled both glasses. "Now, tell me about Renwick." Charles Renwick arrived in Richmond the following morning on the early post road from Baltimore. He had sent no advance word. He simply appeared at Samuel's office at 9 o'clock, a large and self-contained man of 45, who had made his fortune in shipping contracts, and who was accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his presence. He looked at Abigail across the desk and said, "You cost me $40,000. Jonathan Harcourt cost you $40,000, Abigail said. "I cost you nothing. I simply stopped him before he could cost you more." Renwick studied her. He had the measuring quality of a man who evaluated everything in terms of risk and return, and he was applying that quality to her now without particular subtlety. "I have warehouses built," he said. "Materials contracted, workers hired, based on a transaction your husband guaranteed was sound. My husband guaranteed you access to land he did not own, using legal authority he did not have, against a trust instrument he had altered with a forged signature." Abigail kept her voice level. "I am not responsible for what he guaranteed. I am responsible for what the trust owns and what it can legitimately offer." "Which is what exactly?" She placed a document on the desk between them. "A limited shipping lease, 15 years, renewable, access to the deep water landing during the commercial season, under terms that preserve tenant water rights and public river access. Revenue sharing at 12% of net, audited annually by an independent account. Local labor preference for any construction or maintenance work on the landing structures. And a written guarantee that no future land sale will occur without proper trust authorization and 30 days advance notice to active commercial partners." Renwick picked up this document. He read it. He set it down. "The terms are less favorable than what Jonathan offered. Jonathan offered you land he didn't own. I am offering you a lease on land I do." Abigail leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Renwick, you are a man who built a shipping business on contracts that held. I am offering you a contract that will hold. The only question is whether you prefer the certainty of a smaller arrangement to the memory of a larger one that never existed." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, somewhere, a wagon passed on the street, and the city moved around them with its ordinary indifferent commerce. "The 12% is non-negotiable," he said. The 12% is non-negotiable. The audit clause, non-negotiable. The local labor preference, non-negotiable. Something shifted in his expression. Not respect exactly. Renwick was not a man who moved quickly to respect, but recognition. The recognition of one careful person by another. Jonathan told me, he said, almost to himself, that his wife was not a business concern, that she managed the household and left the commercial matters to him. Yes, Abigail said. He told a great many people a great many things about me. Renwick picked up the document again. I'll need my attorney to review this. Of course, Samuel Price will be available this afternoon. She stood. Mr. Renwick, I want to say one thing plainly. What Jonathan did was not only fraud against the trust, it was fraud against you. He took your investment capital and your commercial planning and your professional reputation, and he used them for a transaction that was never legal. You were not only his victim in business terms, you were his tool, the same way others were his tools. She paused. I have no interest in adding to that injury. The lease I am offering is legitimate, commercially reasonable, and built on actual ground. I hope you will consider it on those terms. Renwick was quiet for a moment. You're nothing like what he described, he said. No, Abigail said. I reckon I'm not. She left him with Samuel and walked out into the Richmond morning, and she allowed herself, for the first time since the hearing, one full breath that did not require managing anything. One full breath. That was all she allowed. Then she thought about the tenant families and started walking back. She met with the tenant representatives on Wednesday. Samuel had arranged it in the old mill hall on the north edge of the Prescott property, the hall that generations of tenant meetings had used, that smelled of grain dust and old timber, and the particular human warmth of rooms that have held a great many serious conversations. 11 family representatives came. Some she knew by name since childhood. The Hendricks, whose great-grandfather had been among the first tenants Elias Prescott settled on the land. The Coopers, who ran the Eastern Grain Press. The Morrow family, whose widow had been managing the farm alone since her husband broke his leg in the spring and had not recovered well. Margaret Silas's sister, who sat in the back with her hands folded and did not speak, but whose presence said everything about what was at stake. Abigail stood at the front of the room. She did not use notes. I am going to tell you everything, she said. Not a managed version of it. Everything. She told them about the redirected rents, about the development accounts, about the bank's loan and the collateral that listed equipment some of them used daily. She told them about Miriam Bell's bridge loan and the terms and the timeline for the trust account release. She told them about the Renwick lease negotiation and what it would and would not mean for their river access. The room was quiet while she spoke. The particular quiet of people listening hard because they need to understand, not because they are being politely patient. When she finished, a man named Cole Hendricks, 60 years old, the kind of farmer whose entire life was written in the way he sat, square and settled, said, "So the equipment's safe?" "Yes. For the bridge period, yes. And the rents we overpaid will be credited against the next 12 months. Every family that had payments redirected without credit will have the amounts documented and applied. And the Renwick lease won't touch the river access we use for barge transport. I will guarantee that in writing, in the lease terms, before it is signed." She paused. "If the terms don't protect your access, I won't sign it." Cole Hendricks looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up. "Mrs. Harcourt, I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "Your husband ran this estate for 6 years. He redirected our rents. He pledged our equipment without our knowledge. He almost sold the landing out from under us." He paused. "Why should we trust the next arrangement?" It was the right question. It was the only question, really. "You shouldn't trust it because I'm asking you to," Abigail said. "You should trust it because every agreement will be read aloud before anyone signs. Because you will have the right to request an independent witness for any document. Because the trust ledgers will be open to tenant review twice a year. Because if something goes wrong with an account or a record, you will hear about it from me before you read it somewhere else." She looked at him steadily. I cannot give you back the 6 years my husband managed this land. I can only show you what the next 6 look like. That's all anyone can honestly offer." Cole Hendricks nodded slowly. The kind of nod that doesn't mean agreement yet, but means a man is willing to keep listening. It was enough. For now, it was enough. After the meeting, Margaret, Silas's sister, waited until everyone else had moved outside. She was a small woman in her early 50s, with the practical, undecorated manner of someone who has managed hardship without the comfort of being able to complain about it. She said, "Silas told me what you promised him, about the tenancy." Abigail stood alone in the mill hall for a moment. The grain dust settled in the light. The timber breathed around her the way old buildings breathe, with the slow patience of things that have outlasted many human urgencies. She thought about her father standing in a room very much like this one, 30 years ago, telling a tenant family that the Prescott land was as much theirs to work as his to hold. That a trust was not a trophy. That the whole point of holding something well was what the holding made possible for other people. She had not understood that at 9 years old. She understood it now with her whole body. She walked out into the Virginia summer and went back to work. The bank's attorney came to Samuel's office on Thursday. His name was Porter, and he arrived with the crisp, professional confidence of a man holding a valid legal claim who expects no significant resistance. He laid the loan documents on Samuel's desk, cited the collateral provisions, and outlined the bank's timeline for moving on the equipment. Samuel reviewed the documents for 2 full minutes in silence. Then he placed 3 items alongside them. The fraud finding from Judge Keating's ruling, the alteration evidence from the trustee authorization, and a written legal analysis arguing that a loan secured against property misrepresented as free of trust claims was voidable in its entirety on grounds of fraudulent inducement. Porter read the analysis. His crisp confidence did not disappear, but it reorganized itself into something more cautious. "The bank's position," he said carefully, "is that they were a third-party lender in good faith." "The bank's position," Samuel said, "is going to be tested in a proceeding that will establish whether a lending institution that failed to conduct basic title verification before issuing a $40,000 development loan qualifies as a good faith party." He paused. "That is a proceeding neither the bank nor the trust can afford in terms of time and cost. I suggest we discuss alternatives." Porter looked at him. "What alternatives?" "The trust will assume the operating loans tied to tenant land and equipment, at the original terms, as part of the estate restructuring. The development loan, the commercial canal portion, is subject to the fraud proceeding, and the bank will pursue recovery from Jonathan Harcourt personally on that amount." Samuel folded his hands. "The tenant families are not collateral, they are people. The bank will not be moving on their equipment." Porter was quiet for a moment. He was doing calculations, the kind that involved not just money, but reputation and public accountability, and the particular exposure of a lending institution that had financed a fraud. "The operating loan assumption," he said, "at original terms." "Yes." "And the development loan recovery from Harcourt personally." "That is between the bank and Jonathan Harcourt. It has nothing to do with the trust." Another pause. "I'll need to consult with the bank's directors." "I would expect so." Samuel's tone was cordial and entirely unmovable. "I've prepared a written summary of the proposal. Please take it with you." After Porter left, Abigail, who had been sitting in the corner chair throughout the meeting without speaking, looked at Samuel. "You didn't mention Miriam's bridge loan," she said. "I didn't need to. The bridge loan means we can wait them out if they decline." Porter could see that. Samuel permitted himself a small, dry smile. He also knows that a headline about a Richmond bank seizing farming equipment from tenant families on land cleared of fraud would be the kind of headline that follows an institution for a decade. "You threatened them." I described the situation accurately. He began organizing the documents. "There is a difference. My father used to say exactly that. Your father taught me to say it." Jonathan's letter arrived on Friday evening. It came to Samuel's office, addressed to Abigail in Jonathan's handwriting, sealed with plain wax. No Harcourt crest, just wax. Samuel set it on the desk without comment. Abigail looked at it for a moment. She picked it up. She broke the seal. It was not long. Jonathan had never been a man for long letters. He was precise, even in his personal expressions, which was one of the things she had once admired about him and had later understood was partly the precision of a man who measured every word for its effect. He wrote, "The criminal referral. I wanted you to know that I will not contest it. Webb has advised me of my options. I have declined the ones that require me to dispute the signature evidence. I know what I did. I am aware that knowing it does not change it. I do not expect this letter to change anything either. I am writing it because there is one thing I want to say that has nothing to do with the law or the trust or the land, and that is this. The letter you wrote me in our first year, the one Webb produced at the hearing, I have kept it since the week you wrote it. I kept it because it was true when you wrote it. I need you to know that I understood it was true. I understood what you were offering me, and I chose something else instead. I am sorry for that choice, not for its consequences to me, for what it cost you to discover you had made it with me." Abigail read it twice. She folded it. She sat with it folded in her hands for several minutes. Then she placed it in the document box on Samuel's desk, the same box where the trust instrument and the pre-flood survey were filed, and she set it beneath them, not as a trophy and not as a wound, but as a record. A true account of something that had been real and had become something else, and whose ending was neither as simple as victory nor as simple as loss. She did not respond to the letter. There was nothing to respond to. He had not asked her for anything. He had simply told the truth, finally, in a way that required nothing from her. She accepted the truth the same way, quietly, without ceremony, without reopening anything that had been closed in that courthouse corridor. She closed the document box. Lydia came to the office on Saturday morning. She knocked. She did not enter until Abigail said to. She stood in the doorway for a moment in a plain dress, the gray one again, or one very like it, and she had the look of a woman who has reduced herself deliberately to her actual dimensions after spending years inflating them. "The invitations have stopped," she said. There was no self-pity in it. It was a report. "Yes," Abigail said. "I imagined they would. My father's creditors have accepted the misrepresentation defense. His attorney says the exposure is manageable." She paused. "Thank you for that. I separated your father's situation from Jonathan's because the evidence supported it, not as a favor, I know." Lydia stepped into the room but did not sit. "I want to tell you something. The night of the dinner, when you said, 'Mercy is a generous word for a woman standing on another woman's floor.'" She stopped. "I told myself afterward that you said it because you knew something I didn't, that you had some advantage that made you unafraid." She looked at Abigail. "I've been thinking about it since the hearing. I don't think that's why you said it." Abigail waited. "I think you said it because it was true," Lydia said. "And because it was true, you weren't afraid of it. Not because you had prepared it. Not because you knew about the trust and felt protected, but because—" She stopped again. "Because some people just know when something is true, and they're not afraid to say it, even when the whole room is laughing." She looked at her hands. "I have never been that kind of person. I have always known what the room wanted and given it to them." "That is a skill," Abigail said. "It is a very lonely one." Abigail looked at her for a moment. At the gray dress and the reduced dimensions and the late, genuine honesty of a woman who had arrived at the truth by a route that had cost her considerably. "I have a proposal," she said. "Not a forgiveness. I want to be clear about that. It is not forgiveness." Lydia nodded. "The trust will need someone to manage the incoming correspondence from tenant families, legal partners, and commercial lessees during the account restructuring. It requires precision, confidentiality, and the ability to keep accurate records under a great deal of simultaneous pressure." She paused. "It is not a prestigious position. It pays a modest working salary. It will bring you into contact with people who know your name from the newspapers and who will have opinions. And you're offering it to me." "I'm offering it to the person who kept written records of what Jonathan said to her and produced them in court when asked." Abigail looked at her directly. "That is the skill I need. not silk gowns. Lydia was quiet for a long moment. Her jaw worked once, the way it does when something is pushing against the back of your teeth and you're deciding whether to let it out. "Is this forgiveness dressed as something else?" she asked. "No," Abigail said. "It is work. What you become while doing it is entirely your own decision." Another silence. "All right," Lydia said. "Monday morning, 7 o'clock." "Yes." She turned to leave. At the door she stopped, without turning back. "The coin," she said. "At the dinner. It was my idea. Jonathan suggested the public gesture, but the coin was mine. I want you to know that." "I know," Abigail said. "You knew at the time?" "I suspected. You have very good instincts for theater and very bad ones for sincerity. The coin was theater. Jonathan would have chosen something less vivid." A sound from Lydia that was almost a laugh. Self-directed, brief, and without warmth, but real. Then she was gone. Renwick signed the lease on a Tuesday, 12 days after the hearing. His attorney had reviewed the terms and found them exactly what they appeared to be: commercially reasonable, legally clear, and built on ground that was genuinely the lessor's to lease. The signing was brief and businesslike. Renwick did not make speeches. He signed, he shook Samuel's hand, he looked at Abigail with the particular respect of a man who has lost a preferred deal and found himself in a better one than he expected. "One question," he said at the door. "Go ahead." "The local labor preference clause, the one I called unreasonable." "Yes. My foreman tells me the landing workers know that river better than any crew he's brought from Baltimore." He paused. "He says we'll move more tonnage with local knowledge than we would have without the clause." "Yes," Abigail said. "I know." He left without further comment. It was, she thought, as close to an acknowledgement as a man like Renwick was likely to come, and she accepted it for exactly what it was. On the Saturday after the lease signing, Abigail went back to Harcourt House. Not to reclaim it. The trust owned it. It had always owned it. Claiming it back was a legal formality that Samuel was managing with the appropriate paperwork. She went because there was one room she needed to enter, and one thing she needed to do there, and she had been waiting until she could do it without the waiting feeling like anything except readiness. Thomas let her in. He did not announce her. He simply opened the door and stepped aside, and she walked through the entrance hall of a house built on land that had belonged to her family before she was born, and she walked through it the way you walk through something that is yours. Not performing it, not announcing it, just moving through it with the ordinary confidence of belonging. The dining room was empty. It was the middle of the afternoon, and there was no one in it. The long table her mother had purchased from a Fredericksburg estate was still there. The chairs were still arranged the same way. The room still held the particular quality of a space designed to impress, which it always had, which was not something she intended to change. She stood beside the chair at the far end. Her chair. The chair she had sat in while Lydia crossed the room with a coin. The chair from which she had risen, slowly and without hurry, and walked out through the east doors into a plain carriage and a 12-day reckoning. She placed the silver coin on the white tablecloth beside her chair. She looked at it. Lydia's coin. Purchased from a beaded reticule with the casual contempt of a woman who believed she was discarding something of no further value. Pressed into Abigail's palm until it marked her. Carried for 12 days through evidence rooms and creek crossings and courthouse corridors, and one private letter that she had filed without answering. She picked it up. She had thought, standing in the dining room, that she might leave it on the table. A gesture. A statement. She didn't. The coin did not belong to the table. The coin did not belong to Lydia's insult, or to the room where the insult happened. The coin belonged to the moment she had made a decision, closing her fingers around it, not throwing it back, feeling its edge press into her skin. The moment she had stopped waiting for Jonathan to become better and started moving toward what she already knew. She put it in her glove. "Thomas," she said. He appeared in the doorway. "The east wing, the old records room. Is it locked?" "Since Mr. Harcourt took over the estate management, ma'am. He said the old records were too disordered to be useful. Open it for me. He found the key in the household cabinet where her mother had always kept it, in 1812, in a small labeled drawer. Jonathan had not found it because he had not looked in the place where her mother would have put it, which was where Abigail had looked first. The records room opened. It smelled of old paper and beeswax and the particular dry warmth of a space that has held important documents for a very long time. Floor-to-ceiling shelves along 3 walls, stacked ledgers, rolled surveys, filed deeds, correspondence boxes tied with ribbon. Generations of Prescott land records, kept meticulously by people who understood that the land itself lasted longer than any single claim on it, and that the record of the claim was therefore worth keeping with the same care as the land. Abigail stood in the doorway. She ran her hand along the spine of a ledger that bore her grandfather's handwriting on the label. Then her mother's, on a correspondence box. Then her father's, on a survey file from 1808. She thought about Rebecca Morrow, the widow managing the eastern farm alone since her husband's illness. She thought about the 11 families in the mill hall and Cole Hendricks asking the right question. Why should we trust the next arrangement? And about all the arrangements women entered that were built on ground that could be sold out from under them because they had never been taught to read the deed. She thought about her mother, who had understood the trust instrument, but who had never been permitted to teach Abigail what it meant until Abigail was old enough to ask. She thought about what she had almost lost, and what she had held, and what it had cost to hold it. She looked at the shelves. "Thomas," she said, "I want this room open from next week. Cleaned, organized, and open." She paused. "And I want a second table brought in. A large one." "Yes, ma'am. For what purpose?" She looked at the ledgers, at the surveys, at the 60-something years of careful record-keeping that 3 generations of her family had maintained against the particular entropy of fraud and ambition, and the comfortable assumption of other people's powerlessness. "I'll tell you next week," she said. But she already knew. She walked out of the records room and through the dining room and out the east doors into the late Virginia summer. And the canal boats were moving on the river under a legitimate lease, and the tenant farms were green and working, and somewhere on the northern edge of the property, Silas Reed was walking a boundary line that was finally exactly where it had always been. Abigail pressed the coin against her wrist inside her glove. She had won the estate. She had stopped the fraud. She had protected the tenants. She had built a lease that held water. She had refused to destroy a man who deserved worse, and had chosen instead to recover only what was hers, because she had always believed that the difference between justice and cruelty was precisely what you took when you could have taken more. She had done all of it, and she was standing in the afternoon light of a day in August 1817, 30 years old, with 11,000 acres and 3 mills and a canal landing under lawful agreement, and 1 records room full of documents that most of the women on her land had been told were too complicated for them. She thought, that is the next problem. She began walking, 1 problem at a time. That was what her father had always said. The second table arrived on a Monday morning in the first week of September, carried by 2 of the Cooper boys, who set it in the center of the records room without being told exactly what it was for, and who did not ask. Because by that point, everyone on the Prescott land had learned that when Abigail Harcourt arranged something, the purpose became clear soon enough. Lydia was already at her desk when the table came in. She had been at her desk every morning at 7 o'clock since the Monday after their conversation in Samuel's office, and she had not been late once, and she had not complained once, and she had not performed once, which was, Abigail had come to think, the most honest thing about her. Lydia without an audience was a different creature than Lydia with one. Precise, focused, capable of a silence that was actually empty rather than strategically arranged. She looked at the second table. She looked at Abigail. "Who's coming?" she said. "Rebecca Morrow, the Hendricks daughter. The older one, Clara. 2 women from the county road farms whose husbands died in the spring, and Miriam Bell, who will be teaching." Abigail set a stack of ledgers on the new table. "Starting Thursday." Lydia looked at the ledgers. "Teaching what?" "How to read what they already own." A pause. "You're opening a school." "I'm opening a room," Abigail said. A room with a table and people who know how to read documents and people who need to learn. Whether that becomes a school is up to what happens in it. Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled a fresh ledger from the supply shelf and opened it to the first page. "I'll set up the enrollment record," she said. "Thank you. Do you want it alphabetical or by farm?" "By farm, so we can track which properties have documentation questions outstanding." Lydia began writing without further comment. Abigail watched her for one moment. The focused bend of her head, the particular quality of a woman applying herself to something real. And then went to find Silas, who was going to need to pull the boundary survey files for 4 of the county road properties before Thursday. Miriam arrived on Thursday morning with a canvas bag containing 3 mill lease agreements, 2 inheritance documents, and a deed of trust she had personally contested 17 years ago and won. She spread them on the second table without preamble. Rebecca Morrow was already seated. She was 46 years old, wide-shouldered, practical-faced, with the hands of a woman who had worked a farm in every season without apology. She had come because Abigail had invited her, and she had come with the slightly resistant posture of someone who expects to be told they are incapable. Clara Hendricks was 22, her father Cole's oldest, who had sat in the back of the mill hall meeting and said nothing, but who had looked at everything with the close attention of someone filing it all away. The 2 county road widows, Ellen Marsh and Dorothy Price, sat together and held their own documents folded in their laps, which Miriam recognized and addressed first. "Put them on the table," Miriam said. Not unkindly, directly. "Whatever you brought, put it where everyone can see it. There is nothing in this room that is too complicated for the person it belongs to." Ellen Marsh unfolded her document first. It was a deed to 20 acres of tobacco land that her late husband's cousin had told her was encumbered by a debt she couldn't see written anywhere. Miriam looked at it for 45 seconds. "There is no encumbrance recorded here," she said. "The cousin is either mistaken or he is hoping you won't look closely." Ellen stared at her. "It's mine? Free?" "As written, yes. We will have Samuel Price confirm the county record. But as written, yes." Ellen Marsh pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at the ceiling and breathed. It was not a dramatic moment in any theatrical sense. No one made a speech, but Abigail, standing at the back of the room with a cup of cider she had not drunk, felt it land in her chest with the full weight of everything the past 3 months had been about. Not the courtroom, not the ruling, not even the coin. This. A woman who had spent weeks being told she couldn't read her own document, discovering that she had, in fact, been able to read it all along. She had simply needed someone to confirm that what she was reading was true. Miriam moved to Dorothy Price's document without ceremony. Abigail set down the cider. She pulled a chair to the table and sat down. Not at the head. In the middle. They worked for 3 hours that first Thursday. By the end of it, Rebecca Morrow had read aloud the succession clause in her farm tenancy agreement and had found her own name in it, clearly written, valid and unambiguous, directly contradicting what her late husband's cousin had been telling her for 4 months. She read it twice. Then she looked up. "He knew," she said quietly. "He knew I didn't know how to read these things." "Yes," Abigail said. "And he told me the farm had to go to the male line." "Yes, and it doesn't." "No." Rebecca Morrow sat very still. Outside, the early September day moved on around the Prescott estate. The mills running, the canal boats under their new lease terms, the tenant farms in the last weeks of the summer harvest. Inside the records room, a woman who had been managing a farm alone for 4 months, under the wrong understanding of who it belonged to, sat with both hands flat on a document that said her name. "What do I do now?" Rebecca said. "You go to the county clerk," Abigail said. "You bring this document, and you bring Samuel Price's name, and you register your claim. And if the cousin objects, you show him what it says, and you tell him to find an attorney who can find the clause that contradicts it." She paused. "There isn't one, but he's welcome to look." Clara Hendricks, who had not spoken all morning, said, "Could he challenge it anyway, even knowing it won't hold?" "Yes," Abigail said. "Men in his position often do, because the challenge itself costs her time and money and confidence, even when the underlying claim is valid. She looked at Clara directly. That is exactly why you are sitting in this room. Clara looked at the document in Rebecca's hands. Then she looked at Abigail. My father said you saved the farms. Your father saved the farms by telling the truth in a courtroom when it cost him something, Abigail said. And Silas Reed saved them by knowing where a survey was hidden. And Miriam Bell saved them by lending money when the bank was circling. She paused. I just knew which documents to look for. That's not nothing, Clara said. No, Abigail agreed. It's not nothing. That's exactly the point. The school, because that was what it became, whatever Abigail had called it at the start, ran twice a week through September and October. Word moved the way word moves in counties where people know each other's business and share information across fence lines and at mill yards and in the particular efficient network of household staff who talk to each other in ways their employers never account for. By the 5th week, there were 19 women coming on Thursdays. By the 8th week, there were 31, and Lydia had reorganized the enrollment ledger twice and had added a second file for outstanding document questions that needed Samuel's review. She did this without being asked and presented the reorganized system to Abigail on a Monday morning with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who has found, possibly for the first time, that her skills are being used for something that does not require her to perform a single thing. The outstanding questions file, Abigail said, looking at it. This is good. The volume was getting hard to track, Lydia said. I know. I was going to ask you to do it this week. Lydia looked at her. I did it last week. I know, Abigail said. That's what I said. It's good. Lydia returned to her desk. The moment passed. But it was the kind of moment that accumulates. Small, unremarkable. The ordinary texture of two people working alongside each other toward a shared purpose. And accumulation was, Abigail had come to understand, how most important things actually happened. Not in courtrooms, not in the dramatic single instant, but in the steady, daily repetition of showing up and doing the work correctly, and trusting that the work mattered. Silas came to her in October with a problem she had not anticipated. He knocked on the study door on a Tuesday afternoon, hat in hand, with the careful expression he wore when he was about to say something he had thought through many times. There's a woman at the north gate, he said. She's been there since this morning. She won't come to the house. She has a document with her, and she says she needs someone who can tell her if it's real. Abigail looked up. Who is she? Don't know her. She came up the county road. She's not from the farms here. He paused. She looks like she's been traveling a while. She's got a child with her, young one. Abigail stood. The woman at the north gate was somewhere around 35, travel-worn in a way that went deeper than tired clothes. She held a folded document against her chest with both hands, the way people hold things they cannot afford to lose. The child beside her was a boy of perhaps 5, who had his mother's careful eyes and who looked at Abigail without fear, which suggested he had been taught to assess strangers by their behavior rather than their appearance. Abigail did not make her come in through the gate first. She walked out to where the woman was standing. I heard there was a woman here who could read land papers, the woman said. Her voice was flat with the particular flatness of someone who has asked for help before and been turned away and is not sure which this will be. People in the county are talking about it. Yes, Abigail said. What's your name? Hannah Greer. My husband died in March. His brother has told me I have no claim on the farm, that it passed to him by right. She looked at the document in her arms. But there's something written in here that I can't make sense of, and I keep thinking it says something different than what his brother says. May I see it? Hannah Greer held this document for one more moment. The holding was not distrust. It was the reflex of a woman who has been carrying something alone for long enough that releasing it, even briefly, requires a separate act of will. She held it out. Abigail took it carefully. She unfolded it. It was a property deed with a handwritten amendment at the bottom, witnessed and dated 3 months before Hannah's husband died. The amendment established joint tenancy with right of survivorship. In plain language that was not actually that plain, which was why Hannah couldn't be certain. It meant that when her husband died, the property did not pass into the estate for distribution. It transferred directly to Hannah. The brother had no claim. He had never had a claim. Abigail read it twice. Then she looked up. "What does the succession clause say?" she said. Hannah looked at her. I'm not sure which part." "The paragraph near the bottom. The handwritten one." Abigail held the document so Hannah could see it. "Read it to me." Hannah read slowly. She was not a confident reader, but she was a careful one. She read each word with the concentration of someone translating from a language they know imperfectly, but have been studying. And partway through the paragraph, her reading slowed down, not from difficulty, but from comprehension. She stopped. She read the critical sentence again. Then she looked up at Abigail with an expression that was not yet relief. It was too large and too sudden to be only relief. But that had relief inside it, along with something harder and more complex. The particular feeling of a person who has been told repeatedly that a thing is not theirs, and has just discovered in writing that it was always theirs. "It says my name," she said. "Yes." "It says the property passes to me." "Yes." He knew this was here. She meant the brother. She did not say it with anger, not yet. She said it with the quiet, clarifying shock of someone understanding a deception for the first time. "He read this, and he told me I had nothing, and he knew." "Yes," Abigail said. "He knew." Hannah Greer pressed the document against her chest again. Her son reached up and took her free hand without being asked for it, the way children do when they sense something large is shifting in the person they depend on. "What do I do?" Hannah said. "Come inside," Abigail said. "We're going to make 2 certified copies of this document. Samuel Price will review the original and confirm the county record. And then you are going to go to that county clerk's office with your document and your name, and you are going to register your claim before the end of the week. And if the brother, then he will find an attorney who will charge him to contest a document that is written in plain language and witnessed by 2 county officials." Abigail paused. "He may do it anyway, some men do, but he will not win." Hannah stood at the north gate for another moment, looking at Abigail, looking at the document in her arms, looking at the house behind Abigail, the Prescott estate with its mills running and its canal boats moving under lawful terms, and its records room full of women on Thursday mornings learning to read the language that had been used, for too long, to describe things that belonged to them without consulting them. "People said," Hannah started, then stopped, then tried again. "People said a woman here fought for her land and won, and that she was teaching other women to do the same." She looked at Abigail steadily. "I didn't know if it was true." "It's true," Abigail said. "I didn't know if it would apply to me. I'm not quality. I'm not a trustee or an heiress. I'm just a woman whose husband died and left her something, and whose husband's brother told her it wasn't really hers." Abigail looked at her for a moment, at the travel-worn dress and the careful eyes and the boy who was still holding his mother's hand. "Your husband wrote your name into a legal document and had it witnessed," she said. "That is the same language regardless of whose land it describes. The law does not have a quality version and a common version. It has one version." She stepped back from the gate and held it open. "Come in. Thomas will bring you both something to eat and we'll get to work." Hannah Greer walked through the gate. Her son walked beside her, and Abigail, who had walked out through a different gate into a different night 2 months ago, with a silver coin pressed into her palm, and 12 days and one specific kind of fury that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with clarity, walked back toward the house that had always been hers. That evening, Abigail sat alone in her father's study. The lamp was low. Outside, the September dark had settled over Virginia with the gentle early authority of a season changing. The mills had gone quiet for the night. The canal landing was still. She opened the iron document box on the desk. Inside, in the order she had placed them, the original Prescott Trust authorization, the pre-flood survey in its oilcloth wrap, the court ruling, Jonathan's letter, and beneath all of them, Lydia's silver coin. She took the coin out. She held it in her open palm. It was still just a coin. Small, silver, worn at the edges. The kind of thing that passed through 100 hands in a year without anyone remembering where it had been. She thought about the dining room. The table her mother had chosen. The 50 people laughing, Jonathan's raised glass. The particular quality of the silence after she said the words that were true because they were true, not because she had planned them. She thought about Samuel reading the authorization page across a desk covered in ledgers at 5 in the morning. About Silas at the cabin in the dark, unfolding 30 years of steadiness and one old fear. About Miriam arriving with cold cornbread and $12,000, and the matter-of-fact generosity of a woman who remembered exactly what it cost to be told you couldn't manage what you had built. She thought about Rebecca Morrow's hands flat on a table. About Hannah Greer at the north gate holding a document against her chest. About Clara Hendricks asking the right question and listening hard to the answer. She thought about Leah at her desk at 7 o'clock every morning, building a filing system nobody asked her for, doing work that had no audience. She thought about her father sealing a survey in a tin case behind a cabin wall because he understood that the original truth needed to survive somewhere that floods and lawyers couldn't reach it. She looked at the coin. She understood now what it had always been. Not an insult, not a wound, not a trophy. A moment of carelessness. Jonathan and Lydia had been so certain of her powerlessness that they had staged her humiliation in front of a circuit judge, using a coin, at a table she owned, in a house built on land that was hers, surrounded by evidence they did not know she had spent 18 months collecting. That was what contempt did when it became comfortable. It stopped paying attention. It stopped checking whether the ground beneath it was solid. It simply assumed. And the assumption was always the mistake. She placed the coin back in the document box. She placed it beneath the enrollment ledger that Lydia had started in September, the ledger that now carried the names of 63 women who had completed at least one term in the records room. 63 names, 63 properties, 63 sets of documents that those women now understood well enough to defend. The coin did not rest there as a symbol of what Lydia had done to her. It rested there as a marker of the exact moment she had stopped waiting for permission and started building the thing that needed to be built. She closed the box. She sat for another minute in the quiet. From somewhere down the corridor, she heard voices, low, overlapping, the kind that meant work being discussed rather than pleasantries being exchanged. Lydia's voice and, she thought, Clara Hendricks, who had been staying late on Tuesdays to help organize the document questions file. She heard the specific rhythm of two people who have found a shared task and are getting on with it without ceremony. 3 months ago, those voices would not have been in this house. 3 months ago, that room at the end of the corridor would have been locked, its contents described as too disordered to be useful. 3 months ago, Abigail had been sitting in a plain carriage in the dark with a coin in her fist, and 11 days, and a legal case she had not yet had to prove. She extinguished the lamp. The darkness was not the darkness of the drive away from Harcourt House. That particular breathless dark of someone moving fast with her evidence, and her 12 days, and her anger held at exactly the temperature where it was useful and no hotter. This was a different dark. Quieter, more settled. The kind of dark that comes after the work is done. After the people are fed, and the documents are filed, and the gate has been opened to whoever arrives carrying something they were told was not theirs. The kind of dark that feels, for the first time in a long time, like rest. Outside, the Prescott Canal Landing moved water south under a legal agreement that bore Abigail's signature. The mills stood where they had always stood. The tenant farms held the people who had always worked them. The records room waited for Thursday, when 30-some women would come and sit at a table and learn to read the language of their own lives. They had placed one coin beside her plate and expected her to understand how little she was worth. She had understood something else entirely. She had understood that the people who humiliated her had been so certain of winning that they had done it sloppily, in front of witnesses, over evidence, on ground that belonged to her. She had understood that patience, when it was built on preparation rather than fear, was not the same thing as waiting. It was construction. It was the slow and deliberate assembly of something that would hold. She had understood that the difference between justice and cruelty was not how hard you hit, but what you chose to take. And she had chosen, at every decision point, to take only what was hers, not an inch more. Because the extra inch was the part that would have cost her something she valued more than any acre or mill or canal right, her own judgment of herself. And long after the guests who laughed at that table had moved on to other rooms, and other evenings, and other comfortable assumptions about who owned what and who was worth how much, long after Jonathan Harcourt had retreated to the small house and the reduced life that were genuinely his, women were still walking up the county road to the north gate of the Prescott estate, carrying documents they had been told were too complicated for them. They brought deeds, tenancy agreements, inheritance papers, mill leases, contested wills, the accumulated legal language of lives that had been described to them in other people's words. They sat at a table in a room that had been locked for 6 years. They read their own names, and they left knowing what had always been written there. That was what Abigail Harcourt built from one coin, one courtroom, and the particular clarity that comes from being underestimated by people who should have known better. That was the estate she chose to keep.